Hi, my name is Bonnie Hayes. I'm 26 years old, and perhaps what makes me different from most people isn't that I went to Harvard, but that my own parents took the man I loved and turned him into my sister's husband. It might sound like one of those dramatic stories you read online, but for me, it's a real wound, one that still hasn't fully healed, even after all these years. I once believed that intelligence and love could protect me from everything until both were stolen by my own family. I didn't scream, I didn't fight back with cruel words. I simply stood there, smiled on my sister's wedding day, and made myself a silent promise. One day, I would rise so high that they'd have to look up to meet my eyes again. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been betrayed by someone so close that you no longer knew who to trust? And where are you listening from right now? Tell me your story in the comments. I'd truly love to know. I was born into a home that looked perfect, a kind of perfect suburbia in the western suburbs of Boston, where lawns were always neatly trimmed, fences gleamed white, and everyone smiled brightly on Sunday mornings. But behind that blue-painted door, things were never as peaceful as they seemed. My mother, Margot Hayes, was the kind of woman who believed that a family's worth was measured by how others saw it. She used to say, "We have to make them jealous, Bonnie. That's how you survive in Boston." From an early age, I learned that in this house, appearances mattered more than feelings, and silence was the only way to survive. My father, Robert Hayes, was so gentle he almost disappeared. He never argued, never defended anyone, just nodded and poured another glass of wine whenever my mother's voice got too loud. And my sister, Bella, was the embodiment of everything my mother thought was right: beautiful, sweetly spoken, and always able to win people over. Since elementary school, Bella had been the little star of the Hayes family. She danced ballet in sparkling white dresses, and every time she stepped on stage, my mother would cry and dab her tears with a handkerchief embroidered with the letter B for Bella. When it was my turn to receive an award at the science club, my mother only smiled faintly and said, "Sweetheart, don't be too eccentric. You need to soften up if you don't want to scare people." That's when I learned that in our house, beauty was rewarded while intelligence was quietly punished. When I was 12, I loved taking apart my father's old radio just to see how it worked. He gave me a faint smile, but my mother sighed and said, "A girl who gets grease on her hands won't find anyone who wants to marry her." Words like that came often soft as silk, but cutting like a blade. Bella was always the princess, and I was the project that needed fixing. Every dinner, my mother talked about makeup classes, charity galas, and my father's friends at the golf club, while all I wanted was to talk about algorithms and technology. They looked at me as if I'd landed from another planet. Once, I asked my mother, "What if I don't want to marry someone rich?" She set down her glass, tilted her head, and said in a voice so sweet it chilled me, "Then you'll just be a failure, Bonnie. In this world, people don't pay for your kind of difference." Through high school, I tried to prove her wrong. I studied day and night, entered science fairs, and chased every chance to show I was worth something. But every time I came home with a medal or a certificate, my mother barely glanced at it before shifting the topic to Bella, who had just entered another beauty pageant or been invited to model for a local fashion brand. My father would smile weakly and say, "You're both talented in your own ways." But I knew, "in your own ways," was just his way of avoiding conflict. And me? I only felt like a stranger in my own home. Deep down, I knew my mother didn't hate me. She was simply terrified of anything she couldn't control. My intelligence, something she didn't understand, made her feel powerless. She ruled through fear, through looks, through silence. And my father had lived in her shadow for so long that he had forgotten what his own voice sounded like. I once caught him standing in the kitchen, staring out the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, mumbling, "Sometimes being too smart isn't a blessing, Bonnie." I didn't respond. I just smiled sadly, because I knew he wasn't really talking to me, he was talking to himself. Bella and I were never really sisters in the true sense of the word. She called me a robot when I sat for hours writing code, mocked my simple way of dressing, and always managed to capture every gaze whenever we were in the same room. I didn't hate her, I just couldn't understand how someone could live needing only the admiration of others. But then I realized she was just like our mother, raised by praise, fueled by attention. As for me, all I ever wanted was a space where I could simply exist as myself. That autumn, when I received my acceptance letter from Harvard, I stood on the balcony overlooking the backyard, where Bella was posing for photos while my mother adjusted the camera angle. I whispered to myself, "This will be the last time I ever have to ask permission to live my own life." I packed everything into an old suitcase, taking only my laptop and a thick notebook, the only things that ever made me feel truly worthy. On the day I left home, my mother said, "Don't do anything that will embarrass us, Bonnie." I nodded. I didn't cry. I didn't hug anyone. As the taxi turned the corner, I looked back one last time at that blue-painted house. To the outside world, it was the picture of a perfect home, but to me, it was the place where I learned my first lesson about loneliness. I didn't know it then, but leaving that house wasn't just the beginning of freedom, it was the first step toward the deepest betrayal of my life. I'm not someone who lives on resentment, but looking back, I realize every wound from that house taught me how to survive. The silent dinners, the subtle mockery, the constant dismissal, all of it shaped me into someone who doesn't break easily. When I walked through the gates of Harvard, I made myself a promise. I would prove that my worth didn't need anyone's approval. And if the day ever came when they remembered me, it would only be because they had no other choice. The first days at Harvard felt like stepping into another world. Everything was too vast, too bright, and filled with people who seemed effortlessly confident. I still remember that first morning standing in the courtyard, golden leaves drifting down the old gray stone steps. For the first time, I felt like I had entered a place where intelligence mattered more than appearances, and that, at least then, made me believe I had finally found where I belonged. But Harvard also had a way of isolating those who weren't socially colorful enough. I lived in an old dorm near the Charles River, spent most of my time on research, and rarely went to parties. People called me the coder who never sleeps. I didn't mind. I just wanted to prove that I deserved to be there, not for them, but for myself. Then came the fateful presentation at Harvard Business School that October. I wasn't a business student, but I attended because my computer science professor encouraged us to learn more about technology applications in education. The speaker that day was a graduate student, David Clark, a name everyone in the hall seemed to know. He had a calm presence, a neatly pressed suit, and a confident but unpretentious smile. The way he spoke about digital education systems that could help underprivileged students access knowledge caught my attention. He didn't just speak well, he believed in what he said. When the Q&A session began, I raised my hand and asked how he planned to optimize the algorithm for personalized learning recommendations. David looked at me, slightly surprised, then smiled. Finally, someone asked about the core problem. After the talk, he found me in the hallway. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand. "And you are?" I replied simply, "Bonnie Hayes. Computer science." He nodded, his eyes lighting up. "You're the one who made me rethink my entire presentation." "That was a great question." I laughed. "I was just curious." He tilted his head slightly. "Curiosity is the start of all creativity." I like that. I didn't know why, but for the first time, someone didn't look at me as the cold, distant girl but as someone worth listening to. We started seeing each other more often, sometimes in the library, sometimes at a small cafe near Harvard Yard. He told me his family owned a chain of luxury hotels in Boston, the Clark Hospitality brand. I was hesitant at first. People born into privilege often only talked about comfort and reputation. But David was different. He liked to discuss philosophy, about how society needed to relearn how to learn. He didn't laugh when I said that programming, to me, was the language of freedom. Instead, he said, "I envy the way you see the world as a system that can be improved. Most of us are just trying to survive in it." Our relationship grew naturally, as if it had always been meant to be. David never brought flowers or recited pretty words. He simply showed up at the library with 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of me, and said, "Coffee for the coder." Then he would sit quietly beside me for hours, reading. We didn't need to say much. The connection between us was something rare and unspoken. On late nights, we brainstormed ideas for a project, a free online learning platform for underprivileged students to access top-tier educational resources. I handled the technology. He worked on strategy and fundraising. We named it Open Mind because, as he said, knowledge shouldn't have doors. I still remember one January night when snow blanketed all of Cambridge. We stood together on the bridge, watching the frozen river glimmer under the streetlights. David asked, "If one day you could create something that changes the world, what would it be?" I replied, "A system that lets every child learn without needing to be born into wealth." He looked at me for a long time, then said softly, "You know, that's the first time I've heard someone describe a dream without using the word I." I turned away, but my heart was racing. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, not for how I looked, but for how I thought. David wasn't like the Boston men I'd known before. He didn't need to show off or prove anything. When he walked past my small, old dorm, he simply said, "I like this place. It has a kind of honesty my hotels will never have." That line touched me more deeply than any compliment ever could. He told me his mother was French and his father a strict businessman, so he was always expected to follow in his father's footsteps. But he wanted to do something, as he put it, more meaningful than selling luxury suites to people who already have too much. I looked at him and felt an unexpected connection, perhaps because we were both children of expectation, only he had been loved and I hadn't. The closer we grew, the more I realized David wasn't just a potential love interest. He was a reflection of everything I'd always longed for: intelligence, respect, and the freedom to be myself. He never asked me to change, never tried to make me softer, never compared me to anyone else. When I told him my mother called me unfeminine, he only laughed and said, "If being feminine means being small, then this world will never move forward." I laughed too, though inside, I wanted to cry. In those days, Harvard became the first real home I had ever known. I was no longer the strange tech-obsessed girl, but someone who could love and be loved. Our project, Open Mind, started gaining attention from professors, and a few small startup funds expressed interest in investing. For the first time, I saw a future unfolding not as a girl running away from her family, but as a woman building a world of her own. I still remember the last night of my junior year when David and I sat in the courtyard under the soft yellow lights shining against the stone walls. He held my hand, his voice calm but steady. "When we graduate, I want to turn Open Mind into a real company with you. I'll tell my father I'm choosing my own path." I nodded, believing every word. For the first time in my life, I felt I wasn't alone. If someone asked me when I fell in love with David, I'd say it was the moment he didn't try to save me, he just sat beside me and let me save myself. I thought he was the one person who wasn't like the world outside. But later, he and they would prove how wrong I was. Back then, I didn't know. I still believed. And belief, sometimes, is the most dangerous weapon when placed in the wrong hands. That summer, I decided to take David home to Boston, partly because he wanted to meet my family, and partly because I wanted to prove to my mother that the man I loved wasn't some shallow, showy type. I truly believed that if she saw him, his calm, his intelligence, his heart, she would stop looking down on me. It was a naive hope, and even now, it hurts to remember how much faith I had in it. The drive from Cambridge to my parents' house took just over an hour. I can still picture that afternoon, the sky over Boston gray and heavy, a drizzle misting the windshield, and David turning to me with an eager smile. "I'll try my best to impress your mother," he said. I smiled faintly. "Just be yourself. She likes people who are ambitious and know how to make money." He chuckled. "Then I guess I fit the description." But I didn't laugh. I knew my mother didn't just care about criteria. What she cared about was class, and everyone was a product in her glass display case. When we pulled up in front of the familiar blue-painted house, my mother was already standing at the door, as if she'd known the exact moment we would arrive. "Bonnie, you're finally home." she said, opening her arms to hug me, a hug that looked warm but felt hollow. Her eyes immediately shifted to David. I saw her smile change swiftly, the way someone appraises a piece of expensive jewelry. "And this must be David, the one you've told us so much about," she said, extending her hand with practiced charm. David shook it politely. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am. Bonnie's told me a lot about her family." My mother smiled faintly. "I hope only good things." She tilted her head, studying him from head to toe, the crisp white shirt, the understated but elegant Patek Philippe watch, the composed confidence in his posture. I recognized that look, the look of someone already calculating value. My father came out from the living room, the faint scent of cigars trailing behind him. He smiled and shook David's hand. "Welcome, son. I hear you're studying law at Harvard?" "Excellent. Harvard produces nothing but success." Then he turned to me. "You're lucky, Bonnie." The words sounded harmless, but they landed heavy. Why did they always turn everything into a silent comparison? I didn't want them to see my worth through the person beside me. I wanted them to see me. That night, my mother cooked more elaborately than usual, roasted lamb with rosemary, French red wine, and a dining table set as if for a marriage interview. Bella showed up late, as always, in a silk dress that clung perfectly to her figure. She entered the dining room with a smile like a camera flash, bright, confident, and deliberately dazzling. "Oh, this must be David," she said, leaning forward as she extended her hand, her tone so sweet it almost stung. "I've heard so much about you." David stood up and shook her hand politely. Bella's gaze lingered a little too long. My mother watched the scene without saying a word, sipping her wine, a faint smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Dinner began. My mother asked David about his family, the question I had been dreading. "Your parents own the Clark hospitality chain, don't they, on Newbury Street?" David nodded modestly. "Yes, ma'am. But I don't plan to take over. I want to build something of my own." My mother smiled, a hint of intrigue behind her expression. "A young man with his own ambitions. That's admirable, but people still need a solid foundation, don't they?" Her eyes flicked from me to Bella. Just one glance, yet I understood perfectly. In her mind, Bella with her polished grace and soft demeanor was the kind of woman worthy of a man like David. Bella leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine with practiced ease. Her tone was playful, almost teasing. "David, if you ever need someone to help with branding for your startup, just let me know. I have a few friends in media." The way she spoke, the way she looked at him, everything was measured, calculated to appear just intimate enough to seem innocent. David simply smiled. "Thank you, I might take you up on that." A chill spread through me, slow and sharp, even though the room was warm and glowing with light. My father, usually quiet, broke his silence that evening. He nodded approvingly. "David, you're exactly the kind of man who'll go far. Educated, ambitious, articulate. You'll make a great success of yourself." Then he turned to me. "You've got a good eye, Bonnie." I forced a smile, but inside, something twisted. Why did they always make it sound like I was just a bystander in my own story? After dinner, my mother told Bella to show David the garden, saying, "The roses are in bloom, you should take a look." I started to join them, but my mother placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice light as air but heavy as stone. "Help me clear the table, dear. Men prefer women who know how to care, not women who compete to be heard." I bit my lip and watched their silhouettes fade into the backyard. From the kitchen, I could still hear Bella's laughter, soft, melodic, blending with David's polite replies. I couldn't make out their words, but I knew the feeling in my chest all too well, like an invisible hand tightening around my heart. That night, I lay awake in my old room, unable to sleep. The yellow light from the hallway slipped through the crack under the door. I could hear my parents talking quietly in the living room. "David is wonderful," my mother said. "Polite, promising, and well-mannered." My father replied softly, "Bonnie must really love him." There was a pause, then my mother's voice again. "Love isn't the issue. I just think If someone like David became part of this family, our future would look much brighter. I held my breath. The phrase, part of this family, echoed in my head like the clash of metal. I knew she wasn't talking about me. The next morning, Bella and David were already at the kitchen table having breakfast. They were laughing about something I couldn't make out. Bella wore a thin robe, her hair loosely tied back. When I walked in, she turned and smiled. "You're up. We were just talking about what's fun to do in Boston over the summer." I answered coolly, "Maybe the Harvard lab is more interesting." David looked at me, slightly embarrassed. I pretended not to notice. Before we left, my mother walked us to the door and leaned close to whisper, "You're lucky to have someone like David. But don't put too much faith in love. Men want to be admired, not instructed." I didn't respond. I just nodded and smiled, a smile I couldn't tell was gratitude or bitterness. On the drive back to Cambridge, David held my hand. "Your family is fascinating," he said. I asked, "Fascinating how?" He smiled. "Your mother is strong, your sister is charming, and you're brilliant. That's a rare combination." I went silent. Inside, something small cracked, something I didn't yet have a name for. I turned to look out the window as the trees along the road blurred past, and a quiet intuition settled in me. Even though nothing had happened yet, the seed of heartbreak had already been planted that night at the dinner table, in my mother's gaze, and behind my sister's smile. After the summer break, we threw ourselves back into work as senior year at Harvard began with a pace faster than ever. But what made it hard for me to breathe wasn't the thesis schedule, it was the growing silence between me and David. At first, it was just slower replies to my messages, dates delayed by half an hour with the kind of apology that was so David, polite, composed, and perfectly reasonable, leaving no room for doubt. Then, work pressure became a giant umbrella shading everything else. He said he had to collaborate with a law professor on a policy draft, prepare for a mock trial, and attend family meetings in Boston because the hotel chain had a new project. I tried to believe him because for so long, I had trained myself to believe in him. But trust is like a guitar string, too tight, it snaps, too loose, it loses its tone. Some nights I sat staring at my phone's blue glow, watching the clock slide past midnight, whispering to myself not to be selfish. I kept reminding myself that the man I loved had his own path to follow, and I needed to be mature enough to respect that. Yet a small, persistent question kept tapping against my chest. Why did all his busyness suddenly have no space for me? The days fell into an uneasy rhythm. David always seemed to disappear at the exact moments I needed him most, like when my thesis draft came back with major revisions, and all I wanted was a hug. When I called, he said he was meeting a potential investor for OpenMind, someone I had never met. Stranger still, he changed the subject every time I asked for details. A week before my thesis submission, I was fixing the final lines of code for the learning recommendation system when my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. Her voice was unusually soft. "You should come home, Bonnie. Bella needs you." I asked, "Needs me for what?" She replied, "There are things you have to see with your own eyes to understand." I stood by the lab window, staring at the gray Boston sky, watching people pass like fading dots on the street below, and I knew whatever I'd been running from was waiting for me back at that old house. I didn't know that night would tear apart everything I still had left inside. Boston greeted me with that damp wind rising from the river, the taste of salt and metal on my tongue. When I stepped into the house, it was quiet except for the faint clinking of glass from the kitchen. My mother appeared, wearing a cream sweater, her hair in a neat bun, calm like someone who had just finished arranging flowers on a table. "Come with me," she said, resting her hand lightly on my arm, a gesture so gentle it almost felt loving. I followed her down the long hallway, past the tall mirror where I used to help my father knot his ties, and out to the back patio. The rose garden was perfectly trimmed, golden string lights hanging overhead. And there, beneath the climbing roses, stood David and Bella hand in hand. The kind of calm, familiar hold that could only come from being rehearsed 1,000 times in silence. The world didn't collapse all at once like in the movies. It came apart slowly, piece by piece, like paper soaked through with water. David saw me first. He let go of Bella's hand, stepped forward, and began. Bonnie, let me explain. I raised my hand to stop him. My heart was pounding so fast I thought I might faint, yet my voice came out calm, almost cruelly so. Don't waste your breath. I want to hear it from her. Bella took a step closer, her eyes glistening like she was ready for a close-up. Bonnie, I never meant to hurt you. But sometimes, people who are meant to be together find each other just a little late. Those weren't Bella's words, they were my mother's. And right then, my mother placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was warm and firm, the familiar scent of jasmine perfume, her voice soft as a silk blanket. Don't blame them, dear. They were meant for each other. I turned to David. He couldn't meet my eyes, as if there was something in them he wasn't strong enough to face. I spoke quietly, each word falling onto the stone steps like raindrops. Say it? Since when? David swallowed hard. There isn't a since when, Bonnie. My breath came uneven, my chest burning. I wanted to ask. But you said you loved me. Yet that question suddenly felt small and foolish, like a lost hairpin in a laboratory. I looked at the two of them and saw the full picture, sharp and clear. A man raised in comfort, used to paths already paved, a woman raised on admiration, groomed to be adored, and me, the girl who had learned to stand alone in the dark, surrounded by lines of code. We were never part of the same story. And if we ever were, I had just been written out of it cleanly, neatly, completely. Congratulations, I said, my voice steady. You two are a perfect match. Bella opened her mouth. Bon. I raised a hand and shook my head. Don't say my name like we're still sisters. I turned to David and caught the wet shimmer in his eyes behind it, the faint echo of the boy who once stood with me on that bridge. Asking about a dream that didn't include the word I. But memories can't save the person standing before you. Thank you, I added quietly, for showing me that intelligence can't save a heart when it's given to the wrong place. Then I turned and walked back into the house. My mother was still there, her hand resting on my shoulder until I brushed it off. I walked straight down the hallway, past the tall mirror. My reflection looked pale, but my eyes didn't. Something inside them had just been pulled out like a blade, sharp, then numb. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. It had started to rain. The drops were small, fast, cold as needles. Behind me, my mother's voice floated through the air, calm and perfectly arranged, like someone setting the last piece of silverware on the table. Don't make a scene, Bonnie. A woman should learn to accept things. I stood there for a moment, just long enough to hear my own heartbeat. I thought I was smart, a voice in my head said. And yet I still lost inside my own family. It wasn't a cry of self-pity, it was a verdict. But then I realized something: losing and ending aren't the same thing. I stepped off the porch, letting the rain wash away the lingering scent of jasmine on my shoulder. Before the iron gate closed behind me, I turned back and whispered, just loud enough for myself to hear, goodbye. Not goodbye to David, or Bella, or my mother, but to the girl who once believed that being good was enough for people to be good in return. I ran into the rain, without an umbrella, without a plan, carrying nothing but my thesis draft in my bag and a heart as hollow as a laboratory after closing hours. Congratulations, I said, my voice steady. You two are a perfect match. Bella opened her mouth. Bon. I raised a hand and shook my head. Don't say my name like we're still sisters. I turned to David and caught the wet shimmer in his eyes behind it, the faint echo of the boy who once stood with me on that bridge. Asking about a dream that didn't include the word I. But memories can't save the person standing before you. Thank you, I added quietly, for showing me that intelligence can't save a heart when it's given to the wrong place. Then I turned and walked back into the house. My mother was still there, her hand resting on my shoulder until I brushed it off. I walked straight down the hallway, past the tall mirror. My reflection looked pale, but my eyes didn't. Something inside them had just been pulled out like a blade, sharp, then numb. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. It had started to rain. The drops were small, fast, cold as needles. Behind me, my mother's voice floated through the air, calm and perfectly arranged, like someone setting the last piece of silverware on the table. "Don't make a scene, Bonnie. A woman should learn to accept things." I stood there for a moment, just long enough to hear my own heartbeat. I thought I was smart, a voice in my head said. And yet I still lost inside my own family. It wasn't a cry of self-pity, it was a verdict. But then I realized something. Losing and ending aren't the same thing. I stepped off the porch, letting the rain wash away the lingering scent of jasmine on my shoulder. Before the iron gate closed behind me, I turned back and whispered, just loud enough for myself to hear, "Goodbye." Not goodbye to David, or Bella, or my mother, but to the girl who once believed that being good was enough for people to be good in return. I ran into the rain, without an umbrella, without a plan, carrying nothing but my thesis draft in my bag and a heart as hollow as a laboratory after closing hours. The owner's name was Martha, a woman in her 60s, thin, silver-haired, with eyes that still carried a surprising brightness and a voice warm enough to calm any storm. When I came in for the interview, she glanced briefly at my resume, then smiled. "Harvard graduate, huh? Tell me, did you come here to hide or to start over?" I froze, unsure how to answer. She nodded knowingly and continued. "I used to teach literature for 15 years, then got laid off when the school cut funding. I opened this cafe to prove I could still do something good, but then I realized you don't have to prove anything. Just living is enough." She hired me that same day. The job was simple, making coffee, wiping tables, arranging books, sometimes helping customers find a novel. But that simplicity saved me from myself. I began to count my breaths as I frothed milk, listened to the steady drip from the espresso machine, felt the warmth of the ceramic cup in my hands. In that small space, I learned how to be silent without feeling alone. Every morning, Martha stopped by, made herself a strong black espresso, and sat by the window reading. Once, she asked, "Bonnie, do you think you'll ever go back to Harvard someday?" I smiled faintly. "I don't know. I just know I don't want to prove anything anymore." She nodded, her voice soft as the turning of a page. "You don't need to prove your worth to anyone. Just remember they can't steal your mind." 1. That sentence was like a spark dropped into the ashes inside me. That night, for the first time in months, I opened my laptop. The pale blue light glowed against my thin face and shadowed eyes. In an old folder, I found the last version of Open Mind, the project I once built with David. I hovered over the delete button, but stopped. No, I didn't want to erase it. I wanted to rewrite it my way, with no other name at the top. From that day on, every night after closing the cafe, I stayed behind at the small table by the window, rewriting the old lines of code one by one. I wasn't doing it for anyone anymore, nor for recognition. I did it because my hands still remembered how to create something orderly in a world that had fallen apart. Outside, the rain kept falling. I listened to the rhythm of the drops blending with the clicks of the keyboard, two steady pulses, one from the sky, one from me. I enrolled in an online course on educational science, something I once considered too basic for my level. But now, I studied like a child relearning the alphabet. I realized that real knowledge is never arrogant. It always opens its arms to those humble enough to return. Slowly, I began to envision a new kind of platform, not for Harvard students or scholarship recipients, but for those left behind, the way I had once been left behind by my own family. Every morning, when I unlocked the cafe door, the smell of baked pastries mingled with coffee and Martha's soft humming of old jazz tunes filled the air. She never asked about my past again, but sometimes she left handwritten notes on the counter. Every day is a chance to rewrite chapter 1. I taped one of them to the wall of my apartment, right by the window, as a quiet reminder. By my 3rd month in Seattle, I started attending therapy sessions at Martha's gentle insistence. My therapist, Leah, was a middle-aged woman with a calm, slow voice. She didn't ask, "What happened?" Instead, she asked, When you remember, which part of your body hurts the most? I said, my chest, between my ribs. She nodded. That's where you keep the words you never said. We met every week. She taught me to write down the sentences I was afraid to admit. One of them read, I used to think my worth existed only in the eyes of others. When I read it aloud, I broke down in tears not because I pitied anyone else, but because, for the first time, I finally felt compassion for myself. The following spring, the rain in Seattle finally stopped. I was still working at the cafe, but I had started taking on small freelance programming projects. With my savings, I bought a better computer and registered my first domain, Skilltree.org, a place where I planned to test an idea for an online platform that would teach basic skills to young people who couldn't afford college. I chose the name because I liked how, in video games, a skill tree represents growth, each small skill unlocking a greater one. People, I thought, were the same way. One evening, as I was wiping down tables, Martha looked at me and smiled. You know, she said, you look different now. Your eyes light up when you talk about what you're building. I asked, really? She nodded. When someone finds a reason to wake up in the morning again, the light inside them changes on its own. Her words left me quiet for the rest of the night. Sometimes, I still dreamed of David hazy dreams where we sat by the river, talking like two people who hadn't yet learned how the story ends. But in the mornings, when sunlight streamed through the little window of my apartment, I no longer felt the heaviness. I realized that love was no longer a wound, it had become the soil where something else was beginning to grow. I didn't know what that something was yet, but I could feel it alive, breathing, expanding a little more each day. Maybe that was the beginning of what people later call rebirth. I met Jack Monroe on a June afternoon, right after Seattle's long stretch of rain finally broke. Maple and Ink was busier than usual that day, filled with customers animatedly discussing tech startups around Fremont. I only half listened until a young man in a gray hoodie and round glasses walked up to the counter to order. His voice was low, calm, with the slight rasp of someone who stayed up too late. One iced Americano, light ice. Oh, and sorry, do you have an outlet near the window? My laptop's about to die. I pointed him toward my usual corner. A few minutes later, I heard the steady rhythm of typing, the sound so familiar it felt almost like hearing my own heartbeat back in the Harvard days. That afternoon, as I was clearing tables, I noticed he was still sitting in the same spot, his laptop screen filled with lines of code. When I brought him some water, he looked up and gave me an easy smile. Thanks. Do you work in tech too? I blinked, surprised. How did you know? He shrugged. The way you were looking at my code. Most people just see random symbols. But you, he paused, you looked like you were reading something with rhythm. His words made me laugh. After all that time trying to escape the tech world, it took just one sentence from a stranger to pull me back in. A few days later, he returned to the cafe, this time sitting at the counter across from me. You're Bonnie, right? I'm Jack Monroe. The name clicked immediately. Jack Monroe, the guy who had been featured in Tech Pioneer magazine for his project, EduLink, a free online learning platform for low-income communities. I'd read that article one sleepless night and thought, people like him must live in a completely different world. Yet here he was, sitting right in front of me in a worn gray hoodie, sipping coffee like any ordinary person. We talked like old friends who had somehow lost and found each other again, about how Seattle was always damp, about strange server crashes, about how a single misplaced line of code could bring an entire system down. Jack didn't talk fast or boast. He had this quiet way of listening that made you feel genuinely seen. When I told him I'd once studied at Harvard but never finished, he didn't ask why. He simply said, I think truly smart people know when to stop. His words left me silent for a while, then I smiled. Over the next few weeks, Jack became a regular at Maple and Ink. Sometimes he brought his laptop to work, other times he just read or helped Martha fix the coffee machine when it jammed. One quiet evening, after closing time, he said, I'm expanding EduLink. We're adding a digital skills program for older workers. I need someone who understands both technology and people. Bonnie, I think you'd be perfect for it. I looked up, startled. I'm not really in tech anymore. He smiled gently. Maybe. But tech never really left you. I accepted the offer half out of curiosity, half because I felt I owed the world one more try. In the beginning, I worked from Edulink's small office, a mezzanine floor in an old building, wooden panels creaking underfoot, the air thick with the scent of coffee and computers. Jack's team had only 7 people, most of them engineers and retired teachers. The atmosphere was nothing like Harvard or any startup I'd ever heard of. There were no KPI charts, no think big slogans, just people sitting together because they believed knowledge should never be gated. Jack gave me complete creative freedom. You know what learners need most, he said. Build the platform your way. I stayed up late rewriting the system's architecture, adding game-based learning modules, improving the recommendation algorithm, the same foundation I'd once built for OpenMind. But this time, it felt different. I wasn't trying to prove anything, I was simply doing something that made me feel at peace. Every time the system ran smoothly, I smiled, as if stitching together one more tear in myself. Jack was nothing like David, utterly different, almost disarmingly so. David had entered every room like a gust of wind carrying the scent of ambition and cologne. Jack was a quieter breeze, slipping through a window, steady, subtle, grounding. He never spoke of global vision. He talked about how to make a single mother in Ohio feel confident learning basic computer skills. When I once asked, "Don't you want to scale big?" he smiled and said, "I want to invest in people, not in balance sheets." One night, we both stayed late to fix a system bug. Jack brought 2 boxes of pasta and a cheap bottle of red wine. We ate at our desks under the soft glow of the monitors. He told me he had once failed at a previous startup because he'd chased investors and lost sight of his purpose. I built Edulink to make amends, he said, mostly with myself. I nodded. I'm making amends too with the version of me who thought being good was enough. Jack looked at me and said softly, "Sometimes forgiving yourself is the first step to becoming better." I didn't know how to respond, only that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of being truly seen. We worked together almost every day. I handled the technical and content side, he managed community growth. Edulink began to gain traction, first hundreds of users, then thousands. One day, an older student from Texas sent an email that read, "Thank you, Edulink. Because of your lessons, I found my first job after being laid off. I don't feel useless anymore." I finished reading it, and tears fell before I even knew why. Maybe because I saw myself in those words, the person who once believed she was worthless, only to realize that value never disappears, it just hides under layers of pain until rediscovered. By the 8th month, a large nonprofit organization reached out, offering to partner with us. Jack wanted me to present the project. I panicked. "You should do it, you're the founder." But, he said, "No, Bonnie. You're Edulink's technical heart. People need to see that face." On the day of the presentation, I stood on a small stage, my hands trembling slightly. But when the screen behind me lit up with the words "Education for everyone, everywhere," my heartbeat steadied. I spoke about how knowledge should never have doors, about the people learning through Edulink in their small rooms across the country, and about how technology could restore faith in oneself. When it ended, Jack was standing in the wings, clapping first. The look in his eyes wasn't the pride of a superior, it was the understanding of someone who knew I had just crossed the greatest fear of my life. We never spoke about love. We didn't need to. Between us was a different kind of connection, quiet, constant. Sometimes, when I worked late, Jack left a note on my desk that said, "Don't forget dinner," with a small chocolate bar beside it. Other nights, he paused by my door and asked, "You okay?" Not the polite kind of question, but a real one. And every time, I'd answer, "I'm okay," even though what I really meant was, "I'm healing." Little by little, I was coming back to life. I realized that real love isn't about grand romance, it's when someone helps you see that you're already enough, even when you're not trying to prove it. Jack never once said, "I love you," but I felt it in everything he did. In the way he listened to my ideas without interrupting, in the way he let me fail without stepping in to fix things, and in the way he told me, whether EduLink succeeds or not, you've already changed countless lives. By the end of that year, EduLink was named the Outstanding Community Education Project of Washington State. Our entire team celebrated with cold pizza and cheap beer. I looked around the cramped office, at all those bright, exhausted faces, then at Jack, the unassuming man sitting cross-legged on his chair, smiling quietly, and I knew just how far I'd come since that rainy night years ago. Not because someone had rescued me, but because I had finally opened the door to my own heart again. That night, back in my tiny apartment, I sat by the window and looked out over Seattle, glowing in the dark. I thought of Martha, of Leah, of the students typing away on EduLink, and it struck me. I had found my purpose not in being loved, but in helping others realize they were worthy of love, even after the world had turned its back on them. And maybe that is the deepest kind of love one human being can give another. 3 years later, Seattle was no longer my refuge, it was home, the place where everything began again and grew with me. EduLink was no longer a scrappy little startup on a creaky wooden mezzanine. It had become a nationwide educational technology company with offices in 3 states, over 200 employees, and millions of active users each month. When the media started calling me the youngest edtech CEO to reach a valuation of over $280 million, I could only laugh. Because I knew the real worth of EduLink wasn't in numbers, it was in the messages that arrived every single day from people we'd never met. Because of EduLink, I can help my child learn math. I found a job after 5 years of unemployment. Thank you for believing that people like me can still learn. One March morning, I received an email telling me I'd been named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 Inches education list. When I opened it, I just sat there, staring at the screen. The words, "You've been selected," blurred before my eyes, not from pride, but because, in that moment, I remembered the girl who once stood in her mother's garden, drenched in the rain with a shattered heart. I wished I could tell her that it would all be okay, that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what can never be taken away, purpose and strength. Jack walked into the room and saw me smiling through tears. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "You deserve this, Bonnie." My voice broke as I replied, "No, we all do. I just happened to be the one rewriting the story." The award ceremony was held in New York. I wore a navy blue suit and stood among a sea of confident, ambitious young faces. When a reporter asked, "What has been your biggest motivation to get here?" I answered simply, "I didn't build an empire to get revenge on anyone. I just wanted to create a world where no one is looked down on for their circumstances the way I once was for being different." That answer spread quickly, and I began receiving hundreds of messages from young women who said they saw themselves in my story. I couldn't reply to them all, but every time I read one, a strange calm settled over me, as if, finally, every crack inside me had turned into a path for light to come through. Meanwhile, on the other side of the map, the Hayes family was no longer the dazzling image it once was. The Hayes hospitality chain that Bella and David had taken over after Mr. and Mrs. Clark retired had fallen into crisis. They'd made reckless investments, borrowed heavily to expand, and when the travel market shifted, those once glittering hotels stood nearly empty, losses piling on losses. Local newspapers began running headlines like, "Hayes Group on the brink of bankruptcy." I didn't read the full article, just happened to catch the headline on a financial news feed while waiting for a flight at SeaTac Airport. A part of me wanted to close the screen, but another part couldn't look away. Not out of satisfaction, but out of realization how strangely life turns. Those who once measured worth by outer brilliance were now being swallowed by that same light. My mother called me twice in the same week. I didn't answer. I still remembered her words from that night. Don't blame them, they were meant for each other. I no longer hated her, but I also no longer needed to hear that voice. My father sent an email with the subject line, "Family needs help." The body contained only a few lines. "Bella and David are in trouble. Your mother is exhausted. I've sold the house to help them, but it isn't enough. If you can, I read it quietly, then closed my laptop. That house, the place where I was compared, belittled, taught not to frighten people with my mind, was now just another asset sold off to save the very pride that once defined them. Perhaps that was fate. That evening, Jack found me sitting by the window, the streetlight reflecting in my eyes. He asked, "Are you going to help them?" I was silent for a while before replying. "I already did by choosing to live differently, they just don't see it yet." He said nothing more, only reached over and held my hand. Between us, no words were needed. He understood that forgiveness doesn't always mean returning. Sometimes it simply means refusing to let the past control the present. A year after I appeared on the cover of Forbes, my life had reached a kind of stillness I once thought impossible. That spring, Seattle was drenched in light, no more gray rains, just a soft sunlight glinting off the glass buildings downtown. EduLink hosted its largest annual conference yet, bringing together investors, community college representatives, and young entrepreneurs from across the country. I was invited to give the opening keynote, sharing my journey of turning knowledge into a bridge, not a wall. Jack, now the company's chief technology officer, sat in the front row, smiling up at me with quiet pride. I had just finished my speech when an assistant came up to me and whispered, "There's a special group of guests waiting to meet you in the lobby." I nodded, assuming it must be representatives from a university or a foundation. But when the doors opened, I froze. Standing there together, almost timidly, were my mother, my father, Bella, and David. Time had changed them more than I could have imagined. My mother no longer had that commanding posture, the perfectly styled hair, or the air of luxury she once carried so effortlessly. Her hair was streaked with gray, her face etched with lines of exhaustion. My father looked thinner, older, his suit wrinkled, his eyes darting away from mine. Bella was no longer the radiant, confident woman she once was. She wore a long coat, her complexion pale, her eyes swollen, the look of someone who hadn't truly slept in months. And David. He stood with his head lowered, hands buried in his pockets, a shadow of the man who had once walked beside me at Harvard, full of confidence and pride. For a moment, all the noise of the conference faded into silence. They looked at me, unsure where to begin. My mother spoke first, her voice trembling. "Bonnie, you've changed so much." She stopped, took a shaky breath, then softened her tone. "Your sister needs help, sweetheart. She's not doing well." I turned my gaze to Bella. She lowered her head, tears slipping silently down her face. "What do you mean, not doing well?" I asked, my voice calm, almost too calm. My father stepped in. "The investors pulled out, the hotel chain is collapsing. David and Bella lost their contracts with partners, and your mother's been ill. We've lost everything." He gave a bitter laugh, his eyes dull and distant. "We made mistakes, Bonnie. But now, you're the only one who can save this family." I stayed silent for several seconds. There was no sense of satisfaction, no trace of anger, only a quiet, distant emptiness. The people standing before me no longer felt like family, but like wandering souls searching for warmth in a house that no longer existed. Finally, I spoke slowly. "If you truly want to talk, come to my office tomorrow, not because we're family, but because I believe every debt deserves to be closed properly." My mother exhaled in relief, nodding quickly. "Thank you, Bonnie. I knew you still had a good heart." I met her eyes and said evenly, "No, you're mistaken. This isn't kindness. This is basic decency, something you forgot to teach me." The next day, they arrived on time, a rare occurrence for the Hayes family. Jack and I greeted them on the 25th floor of the glass tower where EduLink's headquarters were located. The conference room was bathed in sunlight, the company's motto, "Education for Everyone, Everywhere," etched in white steel across the wall. I sat at the head of the table, back straight, chair high. And for the first time in my life, I was the one being waited for. Bella entered quietly, eyes down. "Your office is beautiful, Bonnie," she murmured. I smiled faintly. "Not as beautiful as your hotels used to be." My mother sat across from me, her hands clasped tight. My father spoke first, his voice low and trembling. "Thank you for giving us this chance to talk. Your mother just wanted to—" He faltered, looking at her. My mother drew a breath and said softly, "I wanted to apologize, sweetheart. Things went too far back then." Jack stood beside me, silent, one hand resting lightly on the back of my chair, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone anymore. I looked around the room, at the photographs of EduLink staff and students lining the walls, real people whose lives had been changed by the work we did, and then back at the family who had once tried to break me. Strangely, I felt no anger. Only the calm of someone who has walked through pain and come out the other side, knowing that true victory isn't defeating others, it's no longer letting them define you. My mother lowered her head, her voice trembling. "Your sister needs help, sweetheart. If EduLink could invest or give her a chance to start over," I cut her off. "EduLink doesn't invest based on bloodlines. If my sister wants a chance, she'll have to apply like everyone else." Bella lifted her tear-streaked face. "Bonnie, I know I was wrong. I was selfish, but I've lost everything." I looked at her not with anger anymore, but with a quiet sadness. "You haven't lost everything, you've only just begun to understand what loss feels like." No one spoke after that. The air in the conference room grew heavy. My mother avoided my eyes, and my father sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly on the table. After a few moments of silence, I said, "So now you can finally tell me the truth, can't you? What really happened back then?" My mother looked up, trying to steady her voice. "I only wanted what was best for both of you. When David came along, I saw an opportunity, a chance for Bella to have a stable future. I thought it was the right way to secure the family." Her words struck something deep in my chest. My father lowered his head, voice cracking. "Your mother arranged everything. She said if Bella married David, we'd get the investment we needed. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have the courage to stop her." The room went completely still. The ticking of the wall clock sounded sharp and mechanical. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. "So, in exchange," I said quietly, "you sold your own daughter. A girl who just wanted to be loved, to be seen, and you traded her for status. Was it worth it?" No one answered. Bella broke down crying, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry, Bonnie. Mom forced me. She said if I didn't agree, she'd cut Dad off financially. I wasn't strong enough to say no." I looked at her for a long moment before replying, softly, almost like a sigh, "No, Bella. You weren't forced, you just chose the easier road." David sat beside her, shame written all over his face. His voice was low, hoarse. "I'm sorry too. I believed the lies. And when everything fell apart, I realized what a coward I'd been. I didn't deserve you, Bonnie. Not then, not ever." I looked straight at him, a faint smile crossing my lips. "You don't need to apologize. All of you taught me something priceless, that real love doesn't need to be proven. You just have to live better than they ever expected you to." And I did. I stood up. The room was glowing with the soft light of sunset spilling through the glass walls. Behind me, the EduLink logo shimmered in the evening light like the emblem of a new chapter, one I had written myself. I turned back to them and said for the last time, "I don't hate any of you anymore. But don't expect me to forget either. Some wounds aren't meant to fade, because they remind me how far I've come." Then I walked out, leaving them there, the four people who once made up my entire world, now sitting quietly in a room they no longer belonged to. Jack was waiting for me in the hallway, smiling gently. He didn't ask what had happened, he just handed me a glass of water. I looked out at the Seattle skyline as the sky turned gold. Below, the streetlights flickered to life, and above, the EduLink tower reflected the glow of everything I had built. "I didn't win against anyone, Jack," I said softly. "I just won against myself." He nodded. "That's the only victory that truly matters." Ah. In that moment, I understood something, that justice doesn't always arrive with thunder or tears. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the calm of someone who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. And to those of you listening to this story, There will always be people who try to convince you that you're not enough, not smart enough, not beautiful enough, not worthy enough. But the truth is, you don't need permission to have value. Every time someone tries to take away your chance, your love, or your confidence, remember this: they can only take what you willingly give. Your mind, your strength, and your resilience, those are untouchable. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't making them regret what they did, but living so fully that they're left wondering, how did she manage to rise after all that? So live well. Keep moving forward. Because the greatest victory doesn't come with applause, it comes in that quiet moment when you realize you've become someone they'll never have the power to hurt again. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you again in the next story, right here on Familial Stories Exposed.